Assassin's Creed Shadows released on March 20th, 2025. And before the game was even released, and when you saw some of the early gameplay footage and what have you, it was very noticeable that this Assassin's Creed game just had to go and drink the Vokified Kool-Aid. And when the trailers and the gameplays dropped before release, the reaction was just the way you expected. And it is absolutely no shock or conspiracy theory why Assassin's Creed Shadows got this very negative reaction from longtime fans and from mostly everybody. It's not a conspiracy theory. It isn't. And no, these reactions do not come from those xenophobic alt-right movements. That's not what this is. That's not what this is all about. But do you know something? Before I get to Assassin's Creed Shadows, I'm going to sidetrack and go back in the past for a moment and talk about how this kinda happened, why we are here. You ready? Those who were born between 1946 to 1964 are of the baby boomer generation, and then fast forward when baby boomers were rebellious teenagers and young adults. They were out on the streets protesting against their very own society, their own regime. They became the hip and cool generation that the older adults did not understand. Well, okay, not everybody who's a baby boomer went out on the streets and protested. Not everybody. But I think it was mostly a North American phenomenon, I think. But anyways, baby boomers, or rather most baby boomers, loved bands and artists like the Beatles, AC/DC, Elvis, Kiss, Pink Floyd, Black Sabbath, Ozzy Osbourne, and prog rock. And then fast forward to the 1960s and 70s, the world changed. There were women's rights for people of different backgrounds, of different skin colors, and there were also new ideas into the system. Like, there was this one doctor called Dr. Money who theorized that there is no such thing as a gender between the legs, and all kinds of gender is just a gender identity. And back then when Dr. Money's theory was introduced to the world, in the middle of that movement in the 70s and 60s, a lot of people latched on to that. A lot of people agreed there is no such thing as a biological gender and it just comes from the outside. A lot of people agreed. Another noteworthy thing that also happened in the, I presume, late 60s, 70s and 80s was the rise of the Satanic Panic. And I am not going to go into too much detail about the Satanic Panic, but basically what that was in mostly North America was that most parents and Christian groups were very paranoid and said that the devil was basically everywhere in comic books, rock and roll, cartoons. And then when mankind entered the 1990s, the Satanic Panic slowed down a little bit. And one of the last few things they blamed in the 90s was Pokemon, of all things. But anyways, as I was saying about the baby boomer generation, when the 1960s and the 1970s was over, and then when mankind entered the 1980s and the 1990s, because these two decades were the times when most baby boomers had kids, between the birth year of 1981 and 1995, I think. Baby boomers who had kids in that time frame are called millennials. Also, the birth year of the millennials are also called something else, echo boomers. And it will become clear to you as this goes on why millennials are also called echo boomers. And when baby boomers' kids attended school between the 80s, 90s, 2000s and maybe early 2010s, I think, education supposedly took a new track where it became a little bit popular to give kids participation ribbons or participation trophies, and everybody became a winner. And when you have these people who used to be kids back then, who grew up with participation trophies and who grew up in an environment where the adults said, oh no, there's nothing wrong with you. You know, you're special, you're unique, and you don't need to strain yourself to become a better person. You're beautiful just the way you are. And those people who say that you gotta do better in your next test, they're wrong. They're so wrong. There's nothing wrong with you. They are the bad guys, not you. And when these kinds of millennials becomes pre-adolescents or teenagers, sites like Facebook and MySpace popped up, And then a few years later on, YouTube and Twitter came along. And what exactly are those kinds of sites for those kids who grew up in that kind of a background that wanna be a winner all the time? Those sites are basically fuel for narcissism. They wanted to be center stage on the internet and be the next cool thing. Hey look, I'm sitting on the VC and doing my business. Hey look, I'm feeding my cat some diet food. Oh hey, look at me, I'm in Africa. I gave my sandwich to these starving black kids. I'm such a good person. The 1990s and the 2000s also saw the rise of hookup culture. Now, hookup culture may have had originated as far back as the 1920s or the 1960s, but it was thanks to TV series like and the City and movies like American Pie and 40-Year-Old Virgin that popularized the movement. And then, fast forward to the years of the late 2000s and the 2010s, now these millennials are in their teens/young adulthood. And in the time frame of the late 2000s, early 2010s, that was a time when the schooling system introduced new courses for them, and some of these courses are, naturally, gender theory, race theory, and what is that course called again? You know, when the teacher lectures their students about how all the world's accomplishments in Europe and in North America are in fact stolen, and that the white majority never invented anything. I forget the name of those courses, but I always assumed that they belonged to the gender and race theory courses, I thought. And then, well, at the same time, late 2000s, early 2010s, smartphones came along, and with sites like YouTube, Tumblr, Twitter, now called X, and many other social media sites that popped up in the mid-2000s and a little bit of the early 2010s. Where are these kids or young people going to say things like, people are misinformed about certain accomplishments. All accomplishments are actually stolen. Those who actually invented these inventions are actually of these groups of people. Where are these kids or young people going to talk about this? And where are these young people, kids, teenagers, whoever, going to spew their resentment and jealousy? Well, they're gonna do it on the internet. And that was exactly what most millennials at the time did. And then, fast forward to 2016, a miracle happened. Everyone, do you remember this incident when this black girl started to pester this white-looking guy in the hallway over his dreadlocks? And then, after this miracle was uploaded on the internet, a lot of people started talking about it. The topic of cultural appropriation became such a big deal back then, when it is and when it is not acceptable. And I remember when this video became a hot topic back then. When that video came out, back then in the 2010s, it was a decade when people with blue hair, horn-rimmed glasses, and who were sometimes morbidly obese, and who dressed up in colorfully flamboyant metrosexual clothes, would go on social media, YouTube, Twitter, which is now called X, Instagram, Tumblr, and any other social media that you can think of from the 2010s. And those types of people would actually police other people's language. And these types of people would especially police those types of people who were white. And say, no, you can't like rap music. You can't like Indian food. You can't wear these East Asian sets of clothes. You can't do this and you can't do that. You must bow down and apologize for being so insensitive towards protected groups and minorities. Now, I know what you people might be thinking right now. What? What? Who would want to believe, listen and pay attention to something like that? It doesn't sound reasonable. And to you, ladies and gentlemen, to you I want to say mainstream prestigious companies listens to these people, such as Ubisoft. And do you know what these companies do? Most companies who listen to these people actually bent the knee. They caved in, and when they listened to these types of people, these types of people and their way of thinking, the developers make sure that physically handicapped, different colored person that might have a different orientation behind a keyboard or behind a controller who plays this game or read these fantasy books feels represented in the actual medium, even if it is inaccurate to the actual lore, myth, or its history in the past. Why do these companies do this? Because they don't want to be labeled as a xenophobic, racist company. That's why. And it isn't just one or two companies who abide by these rules, but a lot of companies have sadly bent the knee. Those companies who actually listen to these people drink the wokeified Kool-Aid and inject politics into their media, video games, comic books, movies, you name it. And here we are, 2025, and we are seeing a lot of these self-inserted politics in our media and all of these lingo about binary, non-fluid, he, him, their, them, those kinds of elements in our video games and movies and comic books. This movement with these types of people, with this way of thinking, emerged around the late 2000s, and the 2010s was the height, the apex of that movement. And if you were, let's say, a white guy that wanted to talk about how different cultures around the world have borrowed from people around them, like spelling and language, religion and patterns of behaviors, and how some cultures are a little bit better than others, unfortunately. And if you were that guy, then these blue-haired people with their horn-rimmed glasses did everything they could in their power to shut that guy up. Oh, and by the way, I couldn't help but notice that these people mostly goes after white men, and they don't often target women. Or am I wrong about that? I don't know, I have this idea in my head that these blue-haired people with their horn-rimmed glasses perceive women like infants that needs protection. It looks to me like they're simping, as if they want to earn some of those brownie points. That's what it looks to me when they don't go after women that often. It looks to me like these people likes to put women on a golden pedestal. Huh. I mean, if you liken a woman to be something like a child, then that can be a sexist thing, by the way. It can be sexist. But these types of people and their way of thinking, they probably don't see it like that. And these blue-haired people and their utopian, or rather dystopian worldview of no evil and all good, these people did all they could to dogpile on that person and say things like, how dare you borrow these sets of beliefs, traditions and hairstyles from these endangered species, I mean from these beautiful minorities and their exotic culture, how dare you? And that, ladies and gentlemen, is what they would call cultural appropriation according to them. But one core problem with these blue-haired horn-rimmed glasses people is that a large number of these people who have this way of thinking and these sets of beliefs, these groups of people are mostly white themselves. Mostly. Except in that one video from 2016, the perpetrator was a black woman and the one who was being harassed was a white-looking guy. And that's why I would like to clarify that these people who think like this and have these sets of beliefs are mostly white people, or back then. Well, of course, there are more colored people into this movement, but it is predominantly a white movement for whatever reason that I do not understand. So that's why I wanted to clarify, lest there's a misunderstanding. And I can't help but be under the impression that that black girl back then, she may have associated herself with a certain group that started with a B and then ended with an M. So it seems to me. And how appropriate that video that came out in 2016 would basically summarize that decade when people started talking about these incidents on social media like YouTube, Twitter, Facebook and what have you. Back then, people did not take the black girl's side of the argument, and a lot of people from back then took the white-looking guy's side of the argument, and I am so glad they did. Most people were all like, no, she was the one who came up to him. She pulled him. She pestered him. The white-looking guy with the dreads is in the right. The black girl is the one who's in the wrong for harassing him like that. And I am so glad that most people back then took the side of the guy with the dreadlocks. I'm so glad about that. And some people even pointed out historical facts about dreadlocks and cornrows. Like, one video that comes to mind for me right now is the Angry Foreigner. And he too had to point out that hundreds of years ago with the ancient Egyptians, they had dreadlocks, some of them, and so did some Vikings, and some Hindus had dreadlocks. A lot of cultures around the world had dreadlocks and cornrows. Dreadlocks and cornrows aren't just a black people thing, and since cornrows and dreadlocks are historical and universal, then it just doesn't count as cultural appropriation against black people. It doesn't count. That is basically the gist of what Angry Foreigner said, and what many other people said in their videos as well, and on social media. And that's their opinions and their point of views of cultural appropriation / cultural appreciation. And now, I would like to give my opinion, my take on cultural appropriation and cultural appreciation. This is my point of view and opinion. Let's say there's a 9-year-old child who loves to play with their Game Boy Advance here in the West. And the Game Boy Advance is a product from the year 2000 all the way to 2004, I think. And that 9-year-old boy can be, in this example, a white kid, or the kid can be a black African or a Danish Middle Easterner. It doesn't matter, because what I'm looking at right now is where that kid is right now. In the West. Because what is really important for me, in my point of view and subjective opinion, is where they were born and raised, or about to grow up, here in the West. And I would like to ask, have you ever heard in the year 2002 how somebody went up to a 9-year-old kid, yelling at them and taking the Game Boy Advance away from them? And why did that person do that to that 9-year-old? Because the fact that the wrong ethnicity sitting on the bench playing with their Game Boy Advance while they're waiting for their ride back home triggered them, and so that older person started to scream and yell at that 9-year-old kid and took that Game Boy away from him because it doesn't belong to him and his culture. And I now would like to ask everybody who might be listening or who might be watching, have you ever heard of something like this back in the 2000s? No, because we didn't have anything like that when I was growing up. And ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, where did the Game Boy, where did the Game Boy Advance, where did the DS, the 3DS, and the Nintendo Switch come from? From Nintendo. And in what nation is Nintendo located right now? It's in Japan. And if you were born and raised in the West, regardless of your skin color, if you were born and raised in the West in the 1990s or 2000s or 2010s, and you play with your Game Boy Advance or DS, then you probably didn't realize that Nintendo was in fact a Japanese company. Or maybe later on in the mid-2000s, when Wikipedia and YouTube came around, maybe then you realized that your Game Boys and your PlayStations came from Japan. And if you had a Game Boy or a Game Boy Advance or Color, then most likely you had Pokemon, which was also from Japan. And I'm not solely looking at the gaming side of entertainment that comes from Japan. I also would like to talk about other kinds of mediums from around the world. When some authors who have no connection to another culture writes books, makes movies or makes cartoons, whatever, of another culture or nation. And I would like to ask everybody, when an English author or playwright writes a book that takes place in Denmark, is it to be considered cultural appreciation, cultural appropriation, or just writing a very fluffed up fantasy story with very colorful and big sounding words and makes the story very tragic and somewhat appreciative? I am of course talking about William Shakespeare's Hamlet. And where does Hamlet take place in? Where? In Denmark. And his name is Hamlet. Hamlet is not a Danish name. And William Shakespeare isn't exactly some obscure lost and found playwright. No, William Shakespeare is considered worldwide as the most prestigious, the most influential poet, actor, and playwright of all time, and in the English language, despite its naming and inconsistencies with its environment and culture. And yet, William Shakespeare got away with Hamlet. But alas, here we are, 2025, an American company are adapting European folktales into cartoons. That is, Disney. Or you have somebody in Japan creating a manga that takes place in Italy, that is, JoJo's Bizarre Adventure Part 5, Golden Wind. And these two are apples and oranges, by the way. Disney versus manga and anime. Now, when it comes to Disney movies, most kids around the world love Disney. They love Disney for all the wrong reasons. Even though Disney takes, let's say, a Greek mythology like Hercules, and Disney essentially dumps it down, simplifies Hercules' story and convention to be more family friendly, and his name is not even Hercules. His name is Heracles. Hercules is the Roman name, but kids doesn't see that and they don't care. And you know what? Every time Disney takes something European or foreign and turns it into a movie, most historians, school teachers and adults dislikes those movies immensely. But on the other side of the coin, we have manga and anime, like the aforementioned JoJo's Bizarre Adventure, Part 5, Golden Wind. And that manga / anime isn't exactly a dumbification of Italy. I mean, I actually don't know how people of Italy feels about JoJo, but if I was an Italian, I probably would have liked JoJo very much and be like, oh, it's that place, oh, that town, that city. Now, they got it wrong with all the names and the Colosseum and stuff like that, but this author made his homework. That's what I would have said if I was an Italian. But anyways, as I was saying, Disney, anime / manga, and English poetry are certainly apples and oranges. They are different cultures, different nations, different time zones, different backgrounds. They are indeed apples and oranges, where one wants to dumb down where the story came from, mostly from Europe, make it easy to understand and digestible for all ages, and the other one just tells a story they want to tell without thinking of if it is for adults or kids or whatever, while at the same time seemingly keeping a respectful and realistic view on where that the manga or anime takes place in. That's what it looks to me anyways. And the third one, which his stories were written hundreds of years ago, spoke from the heart, and to this day is hailed as one of the greatest poets / playwright in the history of ever, with plentiful mistakes and overlooked details. I mean, goodness, in one of Shakespeare's plays, he writes something to the effect of, when the clock chimes in Rome. But Rome doesn't have any clocks. Rome had different kinds of clocks. So I'm actually surprised many people overlook Shakespeare's mistakes. But anyways, can you say that these are cultural appropriations when a Japanese man creates a manga that takes place in Italy, or when an American company produces a children's movie from European myth gods or from a historical Native American woman and fluffs up her gruesome, bloody, shackled story a little bit to make it look like some kind of a tragic misunderstanding of two separate souls that will have a happy ending. Or when an Englishman writes a story that takes place in Denmark that don't even have Danish names in them. Or is it cultural appropriation or appreciation when a video game company develops a video game that takes place in historical Japan? Now, there was another video game company that developed the Total War games, and when they developed those games a long time ago, those games really did show cultural appreciation for Japan's ancient history. However, can the same thing be said about Ubisoft's Assassin's Creed Shadows? If you would ask a Japanese person, who is, of course, from Japan, what they think about Assassin's Creed Shadows, and what their perception is, would they say that the game is like JoJo's Bizarre Adventure Part 5? Or is it very poetic, soulful, and has a vast vocabulary of big sounding words, or has some sort of a Shakespearean tragedy within it? Or would they say that the game is more like a dumbed-down Americanized Disney movie made for Westerners by Westerners? Now, I am of the opinion that there is a thing called cultural appropriation, and it happens, or it did happen, when a certain Austrian painter from World War II decided to take one of the Hindu symbols and turn it into a symbol of hate. Yes, that is cultural appropriation. But on the other hand, there is also a thing called cultural appreciation when a 9-year-old kid plays with his Game Boy Advance in bliss without realizing where that Game Boy came from, and then from that day forward, that white kid or black kid or whoever became a fan of Pokemon and Nintendo and Zelda and Super Mario. He became a fan, and then a few years later, let's say the mid-2000s, when the internet became more widespread, that kid in his teens started to browse forum sites and, let's say, Newgrounds for example, and discovered that he was not the only one in the world who was a big fan of Pokemon. That kid discovered fan art and fan stories and friends on the internet with a common interest. And I bet you that 9-year-old or teenage boy did not go to these forum sites or to Newgrounds or to DeviantArt just to spew their poison of Pokemon. No, that person loves Pokemon and revels in its eternal fandom. I mean, you can be a non-Japanese person and have appreciation for, anime. Or you could be a non-American and have an appreciation for Disney movies. Or you can be a non-Englishman and, like William Shakespeare, classic English literature, being an enjoyer of a TV show or a foreign comic book or a foreign movie, it doesn't count as cultural appropriation. And it shouldn't. Now, I am not sure how the original content creators feel about this, but let's say I was an author of a series of fantasy books. And let's say my works were translated into multiple languages around the world. And let's say my books found an audience in, let's say in Germany, for example. And my books became crazy popular over there, even so much more crazy popular than here domestically. I actually will be super flattered that it is so much more popular over there than here. I'd be so flattered. And the money is also good. And I can't help but feel that some content creators, not all of them, but some content creators may feel the same way about that. And what I'm trying to say with this, to go back with when I talked about that YouTube video, when that black girl pestered that white looking guy over his dreadlocks, to tie in all of this, what I'm trying to say is, the girl in that video is exactly what is wrong with our society. Misinformation, miseducation, jealousy, and being misinformed. Not only was she misinformed, she was also crying wolf, and she took out her anger on that white-looking guy. She probably saw the blonde hair and the pale complexion and was all like, hey you can't have dreadlocks, that's not part of your culture. She said something like that. I mean, that girl was severely misinformed about dreadlocks. She, or at least back then, she thought that dreadlocks was a black people thing, but it wasn't. And what I'm trying to tie in with all of this, with that black girl with Assassin's Creed Shadows, is she is not the only one with this way of thinking. And she is not the only one who supposedly, I guess, took those gender study classes, those social theory classes, whatever they're called. She's not the only one, and because she supposedly, I'm guessing, may have taken these classes at a vulnerable age in her teens, now she wrongfully believes that all of the world's accomplishments are stolen. Is she saying, we was cags and shit? Is that what she's saying? I don't know, but that's what it looks to me when I look at that video. And what exactly happens when you have these groups of people with this way of thinking and who grew up in a background with participation trophies and, oh, you know, you're special, you're beautiful, you're unique, and nothing you do is ever wrong, and the reason why you failed that test or didn't get the job you wanted and things aren't going your way, it's not really your fault. It's him. It's that guy's fault that you don't have a nice looking car or a big house. And that's essentially how these people have been raised as kids. Hey, you know, you don't need to become better or grow as a person. You're beautiful just the way you are. That's essentially how they've been raised. And when these groups of people come together with their way of thinking, they become part of a community, they co-opt, and then they destroy that community either slowly or quickly from the inside. That's how it ended with Occupy Wall Street, by the way. And when these groups of people tried infecting the gaming community, that's when hashtag Gamergate popped up and hashtag NotYourShield. And so, in an attempt to fight those kinds of people and their way of thinking, gamers actually rose up and used hashtag Gamergate, and those who were not of the majority, like of different orientations or blacks, browns, whoever, those hashtag Gamergaters, if I may say that, they also used hashtag NotYourShield to prove to those blue-haired people and their way of thinking that yes, indeed, there are all kinds of people of different backgrounds and different orientations in the gaming community. These two hashtags wanted to prove to these people in their way of thinking that, hey, you know, gaming isn't just a white man thing or a Japanese thing or exclusively a Japanese thing. People around the world game. PC, consoles, different skin colors, different orientations, everybody of any background can game. And that young black woman, or at least she was young back then, she unfortunately is the end product that is our modern day society. And that black girl, she had a Spanish name, so I heard. And I heard her last name sounds kinda Anglo. I'm not sure about her last name, but it sounded Anglo to me. And people want to talk about inclusivity and diversity, but that black girl was quite diverse to me by having a Spanish name and an Anglo last name, and being born and raised in America, and she was wearing clothes. She wore clothes. She's not half naked like, you know, how some Africans do it in Africa. But no, that girl in the video, she was wearing clothes. She wore clothes, and she spoke American English. She looked quite diverse to me. And in what way she and those who came in the late 2000s, you know, with Tumblr, Twitter, you know, how this ties into Assassin's Creed Shadows. Because I would like to ask all of you, do you think hashtag Gamergate and NotYourShield was a success or a complete success? The correct answer is not entirely. And now that we know that hashtag Gamergate and hashtag NotYourShield wasn't exactly a big success, I'd like to ask, what of Assassin's Creed Shadows? What is Assassin's Creed Shadows' final outcome? Well, Assassin's Creed Shadows released on March 20th, 2025, and now that Assassin's Creed Shadows been released, and here we are seeing the effects that started in the late 2000s. And when I see these YouTube videos about Assassin's Creed Shadows inclusivity and forced same team relationships, that this I don't even think this is a game anymore. What more of the conveyor belt this whatever this is has gone through. I mean, this game, my goodness, this game truly is the end result of everything, and I do mean everything that is wrong and sick with the West in the here and now. I mean, I remember a time years ago in the 2000s, early 2010s, when Assassin's Creed was Assassin's Creed, and it didn't contain any of that political he, him, them, non-binary, whatever. It didn't contain any of that. And before Assassin's Creed Shadow was even released, before launch, some people complained about Assassin's Creed Shadow, and back when those early complaints rolled in, some people used to say, no, those complaints are unfounded, they're not real, and comes from fake news, actual fake news, from these xenophobic alt-right movements. Those who are complaining about the up-and-coming Assassin's Creed game are probably, those close-minded supremacists who have no cultural appreciation for anything. But then as time passed, as we all found out, those who complained about Assassin's Creed Shadows were actual people from Japan. And if I remember this correctly, they were complaining about how Ubisoft was trying to change history by basically making Yasuke look like the real hero of Japan. Basically, Ubisoft were saying with Assassin's Creed Shadows, we was cags and shit. It honestly, the more I think about Assassin's Creed Shadows, the more it feels like Ubisoft is posting everybody. The game feels like a giant post. The complaints for Assassin's Creed Shadows gotten so bad that it isn't just some people of Japan that are complaining about it, but some Japanese representatives have also voiced their opinion of the game. But just to be clear, they're not they're not voicing their complaints towards, the gameplay or the graphics or, about the game itself. That's not what they're complaining about. They are voicing their concerns about historical inconsistencies, inaccuracy, and the downplaying and dumbification of their history and culture. And of course, lifted properties and trademarks, which Ubisoft had forgotten to ask permission for, because later on, people in fact found out that the banners that you saw in Assassin's Creed Shadow was in fact lifted, and without the proper permission, and apparently it was some sort of a real-life historical reenactment group that the flag was lifted from, and Ubisoft apologized for that. So yeah, I think people of Japan and the government are in the right when they say that Assassin's Creed Shadows is culturally appropriating Japanese history and misrepresenting it. I mean, my goodness, ladies and gentlemen, if they made an Assassin's Creed game called, let's say, Assassin's Creed Crusade. No, that's the first game. That's the first game, by the way. Except it was just called Assassin's Creed. But let's say they made an Assassin's Creed that took place in a Muslim country, for example. And if you could tear down some of the mosques, then people would cry cultural appropriation and racism and other kinds of bad words, But just because they developed Assassin's Creed Shadows with inclusivity and inclusion and multiculturalism and race tolerance and what more very nice sounding words you can think of, just because Assassin's Creed Shadows was developed with that mindset, then all of a sudden it gets the N-word pass, it gets a freebie, and some people on the internet are even trying to turn this into a positive, to try to say things like, No, you silly Japanese people. You don't understand. Ubisoft did Assassin's Creed Shadows for you. Okay? You see, Ubisoft made a black main protagonist because Ubisoft is such a forward-thinking and progressive company that they didn't want to make anybody feel like they've been left out of Japan's history. Just like their black retainer. Basically, what some of those blue-haired people are saying are basically, oh no, those people in Japan who are complaining about Assassin's Creed Shadows are in the wrong because they're being very intolerable against other races and there are no black people in their history books and it doesn't look good for them. Ubisoft just wanted to make Assassin's Creed Shadows just for the Japanese. Ubisoft did that with the best of intentions, just for them. But then all of Japan just have to go and act like a spoiled child who couldn't get what they wanted. That is essentially what some people on the internet are saying to Assassin's Creed Shadows' defense. They basically want to inject these wokeified elements to Japan. But now that it isn't 2016 anymore, and nobody's crying wolf anymore, I hope, now I think it is an appropriate time to say that Assassin's Creed Shadows is culturally appropriating Japan, as in actually appropriating Japan and its history